But anyhow, we wanted to crank this up, and I appealed to my friend John Light, who I know has given a couple talks like this and has written a book on his experience. He's one of the 10 that's over here. And I asked him to come down and talk to us about his experiences as a combat infantryman in World War II, Silver Star and Purple Heart, and I'm sure he'll tell you all about that. And there was a friend of his that grew up with him in Annville. John's from Annville and wanted to say a couple words. Jack, you want to come up here? I think he's going to embarrass you, John.
No. But you said you World War II guys are old guys. And I look over here, I had a night jacket, I had pinks and greens. I was the war after you guys. We didn't either finish it, as you know.
I've forgotten when it's getting scary now.
It's pretty hot right now.
Right.
But just like General Patton said in that movie, Rommel, you SOB, I read your book. I read your book, John. But let me identify some of the commonalities that I share with you. First of all, we're both Little Dutchmen and Big Dutchmen, meaning that we're both graduates of Annville High School, albeit a couple years apart, and Lebanon Valley College. And we also both joined the Army and got on the train at the railroad station, right by the college, right by my home where I grew up. We went both different directions at different times, and then when you get out of the Army, you come back to the same railroad station. I could have walked on Sheridan Avenue, John, but
I did too.
okay, yeah. But John is what we call one of the country kids, because another common thread to tie us together is the fact when you lived in Annville, not only were you really tied to the college because his father was professor and head of the biology department at Lebanon Valley College, and I found out why he became a mathematics professor. I love that story. But about 5 years ago, there was a book signing in the West Shore of Mechanicsburg when John's book first published. And I have, like John's sisters, and this one sister knows everything about everybody, and she called me. She says, Johnny Light's going to have a book signing. So I got on over there with his wife. We were chatting there for about 10 minutes. People were lined up. But it's at that time I found out a lot about you that I didn't know through our families. So truthfully, it's not just a personal pleasure, it's a real privilege to present to you, not Professor John Light, but Staff Sergeant John H. Light. Thank you.
Well, it's a real honor to be selected to speak to this group. In fact, I feel so much at home that I'm about to take my shoes off and really be at home. So many people who grew up with me, who I've known over the years, and many newer friends, and I'm very happy to be here tonight. Thank you for the honor that you've given me. I'm glad to be here to help honor the men and women who fought in World War II, and to thank all of you who will be making the World War II Roundtable a viable entity. A question might be asked, why should we establish a World War II Roundtable? Let me just interrupt for a moment here to tell you that I'm not a writer and I'm not a public speaker. I'm a mathematician and we deal with numbers. So I'll stumble around some, but if you'll help me, we'll get through the evening. The question of whether there should be a World War II roundtable, for me, has three answers. First of all, I think we need to remember the lessons of history. There's a saying that if you don't remember history, you'll be forced to live it over again and again, and we find ourselves doing that too much of the time. So you need to do that. If we, for example, think of Chamberlain's visit to Munich and the outcome of that, wouldn't it have been nice to have had maybe a Churchill over there instead of a Chamberlain, and wonder how the history would have been changed by one little event like that. Point number two, survivors of World War II era are becoming fewer and fewer in numbers. In fact, they say we're declining at an accelerating rate. That sounds bad. If we're not careful, the stories will die with them, and we don't want that to happen. So that would be point 2. I think the roundtable will encourage people to maybe pick up a pen or talk to Uncle Charlie and ask him what he did in World War II, and maybe write it down or tape it or get an audio of it so that the stories will be retained. And number 3, I think the common background of World War II, of the roundtable, would provide a great environment for fellowship. And the fellowship that I've enjoyed as a member of the 104th Division and the reunions that I've attended have been very meaningful to me, and I think they would be to you too. Now there's a problem with all of this. You may want to be careful, because you could get something started here that you won't be able to turn off. And sometimes I'm accused of talking after I should have said that's the end. Well, I did write a book, and I have a copy here which I've just stolen from the table. It wasn't what I intended to do. I just wanted to write something that I could pass on to my children and grandchildren, and it kept growing, and when it was finally read a few times, I think it didn't require too much urging for me to think of putting it into book form. And I'm glad that I did. It makes it a little more permanent, and I can put these books in libraries and other things of that sort. And you have to get your facts in order if you write them down. And it was a good lesson for me to think back through those years, many years later, and try to put all of that together. I thought it might be interesting to make a few comments that are not usually given in a talk like this. So I'm going to tell you about some of the things that had to do with World War II that impressed me. Sometimes I'm asked, well, what did you think of Saving Private Ryan? Was that it? Yeah. Saving Private Ryan. I thought it was a good movie, and but I said there were some things that weren't really handled right. The noise really was louder than that, and it was pretty noisy, but the noise was louder than that, and the smells were different. There were some smells that you couldn't forget. I'm going to start with those. There's something that happens when a whole group of men live together for a pretty long period of time, when cleanliness is a secondary importance. And I think of the 8 days that I spent on a 40-and-8 car traveling from Normandy Peninsula up to the northern edge of Belgium. 8 days, all of us 40 of us in one car. No bathroom facilities. It wasn't as bad as it might sound. The train did stop frequently, and you could take care of some things that you needed to do, and even maybe shave, but you surely didn't take a shower in those 8 days. And we were crowded together. I also experienced some very distinct odors that come from dead people and dying people. It wasn't uncommon to run across a number of German bodies that hadn't been taken care of because the Germans were in retreat, and we were the first to come upon these men. They were taken care of after we found them, and when passed by, but for some time they may have laid in an open field. There's a smell that a burning town has, a smell that's all its own. When you have a lot of masonry buildings burned, and the dust from that just covers the whole area. And you walk through the town, and puffs of gray matter come up from the ground as you walk up. A lot of times we go past buildings that were still burning after 24, 48 hours. And sometimes if they kept their potatoes in the basement, you smell the greatest smell of baked potatoes, and you were all ready to eat. Or they might have had a couple of hams hanging in the basement, and that was a good combination. Smoked ham and baked potatoes. There were some good smells, some bad smells. Another one of the bad smells was the smell that came from an exploding artillery shell. There were a lot of those on both sides. I think the Germans experienced more of that than we did. Even a rifle gave up a smell, and if there was a tank or a truck hit, then you'd have burning gasoline, and that would burn the heavy black fume. There were other things, burning hair. It might have been yours, might have been mine. Things like paint. There were a lot of things that burn, and you've got a lot of these smells, and movies can't give you that. There were some good smells. One of the good smells was the smell of a Thanksgiving dinner, even though it was cold. That was a very delightful smell. Another good smell I experienced one night when we were on watch toward the Roar River. From the inside of a barn, we had the door open just about that far. It's a big sliding door. We were in the hay right inside the door, very comfortable. And being a farm boy, being in that hay just was a wonderful experience for me. That smell of hay was just something I wouldn't have wanted to pass up. Well, enough for the smells. Let me give you a few of the sounds. I have written down some notes here. One is that the shattered eardrums often went with shattered bodies. So it took a lot of sound to shatter an eardrum. I had a moment in a cloud of sound like that. When I was injured by one of these weapons. This is a Panzerfaust. It has 8 pounds of dynamite in the head. And when it's fired, it comes toward you with the speed of a baseball pass, something like that. And when that explodes, you're in a cloud of sound like you wouldn't believe. I was thrown off the tank and into a ditch nearby, and as I revived rather quickly, all my senses returned, but my sense of hearing was the last one to come back. I had a ruptured eardrum that day, which still bothers me sometimes. Gives me an excuse for not getting instructions right. I didn't hear what my wife said, things of that sort. The sounds that were really difficult for us, the cries of our comrades who were injured, and we were in a situation where you couldn't do anything for them. In fact, if you moved, then you'd probably be the next person injured. And that was very hard to take. One evening, one night, a hand grenade was thrown into the foxhole next to ours. And during that night, for about 3 hours, we listened to a boy who, every time he talked, there'd be a gurgling sound. We knew he was in serious trouble, but there wasn't anything we could do. The medics were on their way up, and it just took them a while to get there. That was one of the bad ones. There's some sounds seem to be at different ends of the scale. Too loud. Then there was also the softness. A quiet night in a foxhole is about as quiet as anything you can hear. In fact, you almost feel as if you're in an envelope where there is no sound. So you would listen at night, and occasionally you'd hear, before they'd land, you'd hear a whisper, which was the sound of a mortar shell coming down to do its damage. And some people say you couldn't hear mortar shells. I say you could, but it's just like a deep breath coming out, and it can be very deadly. At that time, also, you want to use sound to locate an enemy who might be trying to sneak up on you. And so you would listen for footsteps, you'd listen for things rustling or things, maybe a rifle butt hitting a canteen or something of that sort. You'd listen for that. And so you wanted you wanted to be able to hear, and sometimes you wanted to communicate with someone when everything was quiet, and you'd whisper or call very softly, a muted signal for a friend. There's another group of thoughts that I'd like to leave with you. One is the mental and emotional state that you were in. I always thought that it was your emotional state that allowed you to participate in combat as an infantryman. You needed to have a good emotional state because battle fatigue was a nice name for a lot of different things. And battle fatigue came in all shapes and sizes. Starting at the top of the thing that you noticed in a lot of people was that their appetite was affected. Some people just couldn't eat. Now, I could usually eat. That wasn't one of my problems. But it was true that whenever we were in reserve and we knew we were going to be asked to go out again and fight again, and that hadn't happened yet, so I was fine. But then the word came, we're going to go up to fight again. And right then, I couldn't eat. And I couldn't eat until we were on our way. Then I was back to normal. And so I had a very light case, if you think of that as a battle fatigue. I did quite well when it came to eating. I was 170 when I went into the service. And at one time in Germany, I was 185. And most of that was muscle in those days. I package it differently today. The next order is the problem with bowels. You have a problem with control of the bowels, and that's can be a real problem too. Especially if you think that it's 0 degrees and you're in a foxhole, and suddenly you really need to go. And what you would do then is pass the word quietly to the people in the next foxhole. Don't shoot at him; he's coming out of the hole. And then you've got to move a lot of clothing to get to where you need to be, and so that was a real problem. It was difficult. There's a physical disability that could result. That would be you'd have fevers, chills, you'd be sick in your stomach, nauseous, and you were not fit company then. So that was pretty bad. The next step was to have a physical breakdown where things really all fell apart. I called it the physical dysfunction. You just couldn't operate anymore. And the really extreme case was the case where someone might decide to shoot themselves in the foot rather than go on and take a chance of being killed. So that was all part of the problem. I think there were some things that helped you a lot in that area. One was to have a sense of humor, and that wasn't always easy. The other one was to have a belief in God and the support of a loving family. That made a lot of difference to you because you knew that there were better days to come. The next area I'd like to talk about is the area of fatigue. You were always required to do more than you could, both in terms of strength and endurance, and so fatigue was something that hit you. Now, I'm not talking about just about the time when our division was moved a distance of 33 miles in France before we got all those 48 cars. We had to walk that 33 miles. We had to carry everything that we owned at that time, which would include such things as stationery, my chess set, a book that had been sent to me. Some fellows had what they called foxhole slippers. I never got a pair of those overseas, but there were a lot of things that you might be carrying, and we carried those for 33 miles. And on that walk, we were told to fall out. You'd get a 10-minute break every hour. We were told to fall out, and one of the fellows just kept on walking. He was sound asleep and just walking. And somebody went over and grabbed his arm and said, "Wake up, we're going to stop here for a minute." That's one of the kinds of things that might happen to you. I had a friend whose name was Smitty. His friend had just crossed an open road where a sniper was doing a lot of firing, and his friend was shot and killed by the sniper. And it was Smitty's turn to go across next. And so Smitty got ready to go and finally walked out onto the street, and his friend said, "Run, Smitty, run." Smitty said, "I can't." He was just too tired to run, and he was shot and killed on that same highway with his friend. In a two-man foxhole, one man always was on duty, and you often would be tired. It was a dangerous time because you were right next to the Germans. My solution for keeping awake was to not sit down. We had dug our foxhole with a seat at one end, so where you could sit with your eye just above ground level. But if I'd sit down, I'd fall asleep, and so I couldn't do that. I had to be careful, and so I stood or crouched. There are a couple of other sleep stories. I have to tell you a story about my friend Ned Hendricks. We were walking through a patch of woods, and the German artillery was zeroed right in on that patch of woods. And they were doing a good job. The shells would hit the trees and explode, and the shrapnel would come down, and so would the tops of the trees. It was a very bad scene for a little while, and you tried to find a place that was pretty safe from the shrapnel. Usually you'd crawl under a tree or do something of that sort. So the word came that we were supposed to move out, and I looked around for my squad. I couldn't find one of the fellows, Ned Hendricks. I just couldn't find him. So I thought, well, he must have been hit, and went on back to the aid station. Well, the next day, Ned rejoined us and said, "What happened to you, Ned?" He said, "Well," he said, "back in that woods, I found a good place to get cover. I was really under a nice tree. And he said, I fell asleep there. And the thing that woke him was two men from the Graves registration detail who came up and saw this body. One of them reached over and took hold of his dog tags and ripped them off. They were going to tie them onto his ankle or wrist to identify him. And he said, of course, that waked me. I said, what do you do that for? And they said, oh, we thought you were dead. Of course, he was very unhappy with that. Well, Ned was the funny guy in our outfit, but a strange thing happened to me, too, and I'll tell you this one. We had a Major Melhop, who also wrote a book on World War II. His was one of the early ones. Major Melhop had been doing some reconnoitering with just his driver, and they somehow got pinned down by the Germans. And so he radioed back to the company that he needed a squad to come out and rescue him. He gave some idea of the position, and we had just been spending a very difficult day, and we stopped for a moment here. So a big fellow, Riley, and I said, well, we'll go look for Major Melhop. Riley was a squad leader, so was I. And we ran along the back of this huge building. It looked like it might have been a Bethlehem Steel building in Lebanon, big building, to the far end. And beyond that was an open field, and there was a bridge that had been destroyed. And Major Melhop had said something about a bridge that was destroyed. So we stopped there and called out for Major Melhop. Didn't hear anything. We ran over to the bridge and called some more. On our way over to the bridge, the Germans started firing at us with rifles. So we thought that wasn't a very good place to be because they could move around, and before you know it, they'd have us in a real dangerous position. So we decided we'd retire back to this big building. And I said, Riley, do you want to go first or should I? He said, you go first. So I started out for the building, and if you ran back to the corner we had come away from, you'd be in sight of the riflemen a lot longer than if you just ran right across the short line and dived through a window. And that's what I did. I went right into the building, head first through the window, my steel helmet, of course. I landed on a table, a machine shop table, and I turned around to see where Riley was, and I didn't see him, and I called out to him, and nobody answered, and I thought, well, Riley's been hit, and I'd better wait a few minutes till it's a little darker and I can go out and help Riley, find out what happened to Riley. So I kind of settled there waiting, and suddenly I heard German voices. And you'd hear something like, "Wo ist er?" And "Where is he?" And they knew that they were looking for me, and I had a feeling that that wasn't a good place to be. So I looked around as quickly as I could and saw that there was a gutter in the middle of the floor where the waste from all the machines would be collected. And I saw that that would be just big enough to hold me. I lifted up a plate, a metal plate, crawled under it, let it down on top of me, and it was just perfect. It's just broad enough and just perfect. Well, I heard them in the room, and I was expecting the next thing that somebody would lift up that plate. I really don't know what happened next. I awoke about a half hour later, and I heard these massive engines nearby. And I went over to the window and looked out, and there were a team of engineers repairing that bridge, and they had spotlights, you know, back in civilization, it's like a parking lot at the mall. It was so bright, and everybody was working and yelling to each other, and I realized that the war had gone on, and I missed the next battle that we were supposed to be getting ready for because I slept through it. So I had my sleeping experience too. I thought it might be worthwhile to tell you
Plenty of time, Jim.
all right. Tell you a little bit about two of my friends who were killed in combat. The first of these was a fellow named Henry WWII. He was a Polish boy from Buffalo, New York, and he was my foxhole buddy in training and when we first went overseas. And Henry and I were a good pair. After we left Holland and went down to Germany to fight, we got some replacements. And I was acting squad leader then, and this one fellow, Rembowski, was very nervous type. He was going to have battle fatigue, you could tell. So we thought it would be good if we'd have him with us in a foxhole and make it a three-man instead of a two-man hole. And we were doing that. And Henry was digging in the foxhole. We were under mortar fire at the time and rifle fire. And Rembowski and I were both standing behind an apple tree, a pretty nice-sized apple tree, right next to the hole. Suddenly a mortar shell or an artillery shell, I don't know which, hit in the tree above us, and there was shrapnel flying in every direction. It makes a zing, you hear it go by you, and you're grateful that it's by you. Except that Henry crumpled into the foxhole. A piece of the shrapnel hit his steel helmet, went through his helmet liner into his head and killed him instantly. So he was my buddy and was gone. He was the oldest of 6 children, and in the Polish family in those days, and maybe even now, the first son is a real blessing because they're expected to fill in if anything would happen to Dad. Well, it happened to Henry instead, and that was very sad for the family. The other fellow I'm going to tell you about is Louis Lux. Louis was my assistant squad leader soon after that, within 10 days after that. And we had divided our squad, it now had 8 members in it instead of 12, into 2 groups of 4. I had part of the squad, he had part of the squad. And if an order came down for us to do something that didn't require a whole squad, we'd take turns, his half of the squad or mine. And it was his turn to do the duty that day. And we were told to man a foxhole at the end of a yard because they were expecting the Germans might try to rush the house that we were in. There was a lot of firing going on, and there were a number of us in the house trying to fight back. So Louis got his instructions, and they were, go down the right-hand side of the grape arbor, and the foxhole is at the end of the grape arbor. So Louis took off. He made a mistake. He ran down the left-hand side instead. And when he got to near the end of the grape arbor, he realized his mistake and was climbing through the grape arbor when he was shot and fell to the ground. he and I had been talking the night before about things that we wouldn't like to have happen to us. And the thing he didn't want to have happen to him was to be injured and to be left on the field, nobody helping him. The thing I didn't want to happen to me, well, I talked about losing a limb, and he and I decided that night it might be best to lose a leg rather than an arm. So I got my wish. I lost a leg instead of an arm, and I want to make sure that he got his wish too. So a friend and I ran out, got Louis, and brought him into the house where the rest of us were. And we brought him in, and he stretched him out on the floor, and I said to him, "How are you, Louis?" And he just said, "Thanks, Light," and that was it. I was grateful that we had done that. I wouldn't have wanted him to end his time out in the yard. Well, when the war ended, because these had been such good friends of mine, I decided that I'd visit the families and be able to tell them perhaps something about their son that they hadn't known from the message they had gotten. And I made a weekend trip from Walter Reed Hospital. The first day's trip took me to Buffalo. I found the house. It was just before Christmas. I had gotten a 5-pound box of chocolates, but there were 6 children and a couple of parents in the family, so I thought maybe 10 pounds would be better. So I got another box of chocolates and went up, standing on the front door of the house, and rapped on the door, and one of his sisters came to the door. And she was all excited when she saw my uniform, and she ran to tell her mom, and her mother came to the door. Her mother spoke very little English, and told me to come in, and when I got inside, she grabbed me and gave me a hug and a kiss, and she was so grateful that I had come. I talked to her for a while. Her daughters would help to explain what I was saying, and so we visited for a time, and then Mr. Golubieski came home. He had been gassed in World War I. He had come over here as an immigrant in 1915, and this from Poland. And so when he came home, he saw my uniform, saw my insignia, came over and gave me a hug and a kiss on each cheek, and then he said, "Wait, we drink." And he went over to the bookcase, up in next to the top shelf. He took a couple of books out, and behind the corner of the bookcase up there was a bottle with 2 glasses. And he got out of those 2 glasses, and he poured us something in each of those glasses. And then he made the appropriate toast in Polish. And he threw it down, and I looked at him, and I thought, well, so can I. And I threw it down, and you know, that started burning when it hit my Adam's apple. It burned all the way to my liver. It really was an experiment. That was my first drink of hard liquor, and it really impressed me. But we had a great visit, and I really felt as though I belonged in that family. And Mrs. Golubieski said, "Well, you be my son. You take Henry's place." So I had her as a, quote, mother, unquote, until she died at the age of 99 about 3 years ago. And that was a long time. After that, I went to Waterbury, Connecticut. The Luxes lived in Waterbury in a rather fashionable neighborhood because Mr. Lux was the owner of a clock manufacturing company in Waterbury. And I got to the outer office and talked to his secretary, and she said, "Well, do you have an appointment?" I said, "No, but I thought maybe Mr. Lux could see me for just a few minutes." And I waited, and finally the word came that he would see me, and I went in, and I think when he saw my uniform, he was glad that he had been able to see me. I told him that I would like to answer any questions he might have, tell him something that he might not know about his son, Louis. And we talked about several things. In training one time, we were probing for mines, practicing probing for mines, and that's a deadly dull event. You get down on your knees and you feel for tripwires. You're supposed to be in the dark, and after you've determined that there's no tripwire there, then you start over here with your bayonet at a 45-degree angle and very cautiously poke it in there, maybe 6 inches into the ground. Every 6 inches across, move forward, do it again, coming back, and then forward and again, and that gives you a count of 18 altogether. So we would take turns counting to 18. 1, 2, 3. You can see it dull. I mean, this is dull already. Well, it came my turn to count, and so I thought, well, spice it up a little. Count German. 1, 2, 3, all the way up to 18. And the fellows thought that was kind of neat. The next fellow did it in French. And then it was Louis' turn. And Louis started, Ichi, Michi, Kichi, Sin. And we all broke up laughing. What are you doing, Louis? This is Japanese. And he was all ready to go on when the lieutenant came over. He said, what's going on here? We were having too much fun. He said, what's going on here? And Louis said, sir, we're probing for mines. He said, well, what's with the ichi-michi business? He says, well, sir, I was counting in Japanese just for a change. And we all snickered because we knew it wasn't Japanese. And we knew that Lieutenant Myers knew it wasn't. And Lieutenant Myers said, this is very funny, isn't it? How would you like to probe for mines all weekend? We thought that was funny too. So we snickered some more. He said, right, you're all restricted for the weekend and you're going to be probing for mines. Well, it worked out that way. We probed for mines a lot. Just a few years ago, I was telling this story, and somebody in the crowd had been in Japan when she was a young girl and knew Japanese. She said, you know, that was Japanese. Ichi, Michi, Kichi, Sen. That's 1, 2, 3, 4 in Japanese. So Louis got the last laugh. Well, I probably should give you a chance to ask some questions, but may I just tell you a couple of other, what I consider gems. When I got to Walter Reed, I was being taken across the compound there for x-rays one day, and the ward boy pushing my wheelchair and I were carrying on a conversation. And then I looked down a converging path and saw that there was an older man in a wheelchair, probably, well, even older than I am, in a wheelchair being pushed by a full colonel. And I said to my ward boy, why can't I be pushed by a colonel instead of you? And he laughed about that. He said, do you want to know who that is? I said, yeah, who is it? He said, wait, I'll see if we can introduce you. And so he pushed my wheelchair alongside the other chair and asked the colonel if it would be all right to make an introduction. The colonel said that would be fine. And so he said, Sergeant Light, this is General Pershing. General Pershing. I looked at him twice. General Pershing was an old man with a white beard and a goat and mustache in World War I. He couldn't possibly be General Pershing, but it was. He was at Walter Reed spending his last days there. Well, I told this story to a friend, and he said, oh yeah, that's very interesting. And then the next day he talked to me, he said, you know, that could have been General Pershing. I looked it up. He didn't die until 46. Well, it was General Pershing. A few days later, I had been burned when I was injured. And I was working to get my use of my fingers, and we had a very nice lady who helped us with our therapy. And she said one day, would any of you fellows like to meet my father? He's back from the European theater for a leave, and he's in the area. I think he'd like to come in tomorrow. If you'd like to meet him. We said, who's your father? We didn't want just anybody. It was General Patton. It was General Patton's daughter who was doing our therapy. So the next day, General Patton came in and went down the ward and stopped at each bed, shook each person's hand, and exchanged some words with them. Went down to the end of the ward, started up the other side. I think there were 44 beds altogether in our ward. And he got up just around the corner, and then he left very suddenly. And I was feeling sorry for the fellows who hadn't gotten to greet the general. So the next day in therapy, I asked our therapist what happened to her dad. She said, well, he got to thinking about all you boys whose lives are going to be a lot different because of World War II. And she said he didn't want any of you to see him weep. So he got outside all right, but then he had a cry out there. Now that doesn't sound like old blood and guts Patton, but he was a man who really had a heart too, and it was a real honor to meet him. I stopped washing my hands after shaking Patton's hands. I didn't shake any more hands for a time. I'll tell one more story, and then I'll give you a chance to ask some questions. There was a lady from Washington, D.C., who would throw parties for different wards on a weekend. And she liked our wards because many of us were long-time people there. Some fellows had been there for a year or more. In fact, there was a group of men who had formed a club. You couldn't belong to it unless you had both legs amputated above the knee. So I couldn't belong to it. They told me that I had a flesh wound. And they had their own club. Anyways, she liked our ward, especially this group. And she came in one day with a couple of butlers and some girls to help make us feel more enjoyable with the party. She had ice cream and cake and all kinds of good things like that. The party had to end at 9 because that's when lights went out. And she would make rounds and talk to each of us. Well, I was getting ready for the 9 o'clock hour. I was having my back rubbed, and the girl who was doing it, when Mrs. McLean, thank you, Mary. When Mrs. McLean came to my bed, we talked for a moment, and then the girl doing my back said, "That's a lovely pendant you have, Mrs. McLean." And she said, "Would you like to wear it, dearie?" And the girl said, "Yes." So Mrs. McLean took it off and passed it to the right hand again, passed it to me, and I passed it to the girl behind me, and she put it on. It was the Hope Diamond. The Hope Diamond. Well, the funny part of this story is that she didn't think about it, and 9 o'clock they all left, and the girl who was wearing it suddenly realized she was still wearing it. And she was wondering what to do with it, and the head nurse was going to put it in the safe for overnight. But suddenly there was a man from the insurance company there to reclaim it. There may have been someone from the FBI right around the corner. Well, that's some of what happened to me during and after World War II. If you have any questions, I'd be glad to try to answer them. Yes?
John, you won the Silver Star. Can you tell us about that?
All right, I will. We were in, this is how I happened to get the Silver Star. We were in Holland, and we were making an attack on the town of, isn't that awful? Well, there was a town in Holland, Moerdijk, Moerdijk. That's interesting, IJK, just like 3 letters together in the alphabet, and that's part of Moerdijk's name. Anyway, we had to cross a large dike. It's about 50 feet high, and there's a roadway on top, probably 20 or 25 feet across the top of the dike and then down the other side. It's a good slope. I'd say it would be close to a 45-degree slope. So you would have trouble walking up with any speed. Anyway, we had a platoon that had crossed the dike and was advancing on Moerdijk when the Germans started firing at them, and orders went through for our artillery to respond to quiet the German fire. The problem was that a mistake was made, and instead of the artillery shells landing on the enemy, they landed on our platoon that was over there. And our artillery is very efficient. It was a very dangerous thing. The platoon was badly injured, and some people came back and said there are a lot of fellows dead and dying over there. And they asked if we'd have volunteers to go over the dike to get them. Well, as I recall, 6 of us volunteered for that duty. We went over the top of the dike. There was a lot of machine gun fire going on, and we ran down the other side. Our stretchers were made from a winter coat with the sleeves turned inside out and a rifle stuck down each of the sleeves. So you pick up 2 rifles and a winter coat, and one of the soldiers to bring them back. Well, the fellow I was working with and I brought back 3 fellows. And one of them was a fellow that I knew very well that I used to play bridge with and occasionally chess. And when we got back from this duty, our company commander said, I want the names of you fellows because I want to recommend you for the Silver Star. Well, that doesn't happen very often, so we weren't expecting too much, especially when the next day our company commander was injured and went to the rear. And I wrote about that incident in my book, and someone saw that, and he said, you know, John, that it's not too late. I could still recommend you for the Silver Star for that event. And he volunteered to do that, and I gave my permission. And he contacted the fellow that the last one of those we had brought back, and my company commander who was still alive, and my platoon sergeant, and they all attested to the facts of that case. And so I think it was 52 years later I received the Silver Star. And I wear that proudly. That's a
You were a rifleman at that time.
I was a rifleman, yes. I never advanced very far. I started out being second scout, and the first night of combat we lost 6 of 12 men. And so you got promoted quickly. I was assistant squad leader after the first night. Then the platoon leader was injured, and our squad leader moved up to platoon, and so I became acting squad leader. That was after 3 days. And so I finally was made squad leader. I mean, I got all the stripes to prove it. And I stayed there so long that a lot of the fellows became discouraged who were in the squad. I was on the line for 155 days.
Wow.
That was from October 25th, 1944 to March 29th, 1955.
That's when you got wounded.
That's when I got wounded. And I'll soon be celebrating that anniversary.
It's tough. The war was over for us by that time.
The war was very close to being over for us, too. Yes, I just, well, I could tell you how that happened very quickly. We were riding on tanks of the 3rd Armored Division, and the day before I was injured, we went 35 miles. And that was, we crossed the Rhine at Remagen, and we were closing the circle around the Ruhr pocket. There were 325,000 prisoners taken from the Ruhr pocket. But I didn't get to help close that ring. I was on the first tank. This weapon was fired at me. That 8-pound charge hit the side of the tank just below my feet, set the tank on fire, blew 3 of us off the tank into the ditch, and that was the end of the war for me. Any other questions? Yes.
We've just gone through a tough winter here as far as in Pennsylvania, but I understand that the winter of 44-45 in Europe was one of the worst in years. Any anecdotes about the experience there as far as?
Well, it was brutally cold through much of the winter, much like this winter has been. It just wouldn't seem to let up. We were.
So it was deeper.
It was New Year's Eve when we were told that the Germans might try something, and so we should go out and dig new positions right along the Ruhr River to prevent them from crossing the river. So we went out there at 10 o'clock at night with our little shovels and tried to dig into that hard frozen soil. You couldn't make a dent in it. So somebody got the bright idea of issuing a half stick of dynamite to each group of 2 so you could break through the surface. So we'd set off our dynamite charge, and then you were through the crust and could dig. And we dug. It was snowing. It was 0 degrees or below. That's without the wind chill, and the wind was blowing very hard. We got our hole finished. We were taking turns watching. I was sitting there. I was supposed to be getting a rest. The snow was going down my neck. It was hitting you in every corner. You couldn't get away from it. But it was a miserable time. We stayed there until about 2:30, and then we were allowed to go. We decided they weren't going to be attacking after all. But I'm a little embarrassed to be telling you all the things that happened to me, because I know that there are people here who have had all of that and more happen to them. But I really do appreciate the chance to have been here. I thank you all for paying such attention, and I want to tell you good night.
Okay. I would strongly encourage all of you to read John's book, because it is filled with a lot of anecdotes, a lot of humor, etc., and a lot of things with which I can identify. For example, the Anvil kids would hitchhike to Palmyra, catch the trolley to Hershey for a nickel at that time. You know, go to the park, go to the swimming pool, go to the band. Absolutely, yeah. And you relate to that, okay? And then you also say in the book about military rations, and I think that we might have an opportunity to join like a class action lawsuit against the United States government because they gave us cigarettes in our combat rations. Remember that? But in addition to that, part of those combat rations included a Hershey bar. Those of you from this community know that Mr. Hershey and the company here produced a very high energy bar specifically for combat rations. And you mentioned giving some of that candy to some of the children
I did do
that you met over there.
It was called the D bar, and it was about that long, about that wide, about so thick. And that was enough to take care of your nutrition for a day.
Right.
I think it did.
Okay, well, I got some good news and some bad news for you, John. You know. First of all, Hershey's still here, and we're still producing chocolate, all right?
I'm glad for that.
But there is no creamery. It's gone. There is no band shell, okay? There is no public pool, okay? But and the park, unfortunately, is not free any longer. So, but the merry-go-round, the carousel is still there. You would recognize it. But you know, to recognize what you did for those poor orphans over in Europe, I had this little chocolate bar made today at the very last minute, and it just says thanks, thanks, thanks. And this says, I don't know, she giving my instructions were too specifically, but this says Staff Sergeant J. Light. Thank you,
Isn't
sir.
that nice?
Thank you very much. We don't have to get out of here till 9 o'clock, so if any of you want to talk to John, he brought some books along. I believe you did.
I did.
And you got a
They're out
pen, you
there.
can sign them. Where are they?
I think my son.
Tell us about your thought of being a member of the occupation force in Europe. That was interesting, too.
Well, let me first of all introduce my daughter, who's at the back of the room, and her husband, Joe. Where are you, Joe? And my son, John, back in the corner, and his friend, Jim. And it's just an honor to be able to share this evening with them and with all of you.
One thing I wanted to add, we've all gotten a great story from a combat infantryman tonight, and I know there's a bunch more of them in the audience here. I know a lot of them. And I've asked that everybody put their name and address back there, and if you've got a story to tell, put a little mark there that you'd like us to get in touch with you, and maybe we can get you to come talk. And as you can see, it's informal. There's no coats and ties and after you, my dear Alfonso stuff here. We just want to get the veteran stories. And if any of you fellas would be willing to come talk, and some of you I recognize here, I'm going to twist your arms. But this is what we want to do this for. We as you see Joe Trojak over here making our video, we're going to make these available to the kids. We're going to start a library of these videos here so that our Hershey High School kids can come and view them and learn about World War II. So any of you who would like to talk, and you know, Army, Navy, Air Corps, Marines, Merchant Marine, Coast Guard, whatever. And I'm so concerned about losing these stories. 2 blocks from here was a nurse, an Army nurse or Navy nurse by the name of Sally Coulter. And she personally cared for Captain McVeigh after the Indianapolis was sunk. Took care of him for the first 2 weeks after he was picked up. And we lost her last year. In Palmyra, we had a P-47 Thunderbolt pilot who flew with Hub Zemke's Wolfpack. We lost him 2 months ago. And these are the stories that we're losing. And it's why I'm emphasizing we want to start this now and get the stories. And I don't mean to be morbid, but we want to get these stories before you guys are gone for your grandkids and mine. So that's my appeal, and that's why we're doing this.
Well, I do have some books, and they're over here in the corner. I'd be happy to see anyone who would like to.
Okay.
How often are you going to hold meetings?
We're going to hold, thank you, Sue. We're going to hold a meeting every month if there's enough interest. I've already arranged for a speaker for next month. I don't know how many of you knew it, but when we declared war on Germany, armed guards walked into the French embassy in Washington, D.C. and arrested the Vichy French government who were cooperating with the Nazis. And they were interned for over a year at the Hotel Hershey. And our speaker next month will be Pam Whitenack, who is the curator of the Hershey Archive, who's done quite a study on this whole incident. She's interviewed a lot of people that worked at the hotel that had to deal with these people, and apparently they were an arrogant bunch of SOBs. And anyway, Pam, and she's got a lot of photographs, got pictures when they walked into the embassy and arrested them in Washington and bringing them up to the hotel. And it's kind of one of those little sideshow stories about World War II that other than people that lived right here in Hershey, not too many of them knew about it. But anyway, she's coming next month, and I'm not making any promises, but those of you that know me know that I've kind of, in the last year, become Dick Winter's social secretary. And I'm going to try and get Dick to come talk to us in May. One of the things that we've set up, we won't meet here in the library this summer because it closes at 8. And an hour doesn't do it, especially with somebody like John talking. So I've made arrangements. I don't know how many of you have been to the 28th Division Museum at the Gap. Have you seen that? Well, if you'll notice, there's a barracks that's been converted into a seminar room right next to the museum, which is air conditioned. And the curator of the museum has agreed to come down there on the first Thursday of the month, all summer long, and open the museum for us for private showing, and we'll have use of the seminar barracks next door, air conditioned, for just sitting around like this and getting the veteran stories. So, yes,
Bill,
Mr. Taylor.
It's a great group here tonight, you know. I'm really surprised how many folks showed up, you know, being that this is our first, excuse me for last week, folks, I've got a little group up. But how many people showed up tonight? How are you going to distribute the word about our next meeting?
Well, I'm going to put out a press release again like I did for this one, and it'll be in most of the area newspapers. And one of the reasons for getting names and addresses, we want to get organized. You know, Joe does this for a living with his video camera here. But one of the things we'd like to do, which the gentleman from Doylestown told me, is they eventually started collecting a little bit of dues, and the first thing they did was buy their own video camera and tripod. And one of their group that knew how to operate it, and they were able to take care of that part of it themselves without having to depend on somebody else. So that's one of the things we want to do. Yes, sir, in the back.
I'm not sure, but I'm assuming that most of us have had email. I don't know, but I can put my email address, I'm sure the rest would. That might be a way to get in contact with people
Okay.
as well. And then secondly, I'm a child of the 50s.
I'm sorry.
I'm a child of the 50s.
Okay.
I was born about a month after the war ended. My family always said I was responsible. But personally, for my family, I'd like to thank all of the veterans of the Second World War. It was certainly a time of change in this country. And I just think that you should know that there are people out there who are my age and younger who do feel deeply about the veterans and the job that was done. So thank you.
And I'm delighted to see all the veterans here. You're the guys we want to get out. We want to get your stories. So with that, yes. Beg pardon? Yes, first Thursday of April is the 3rd, and we have this room reserved, and we'll be here in much the same format.
We have this reserved through
Through June.
June, yes.
Yes, because June is when they change from 9 o'clock to 8 o'clock. But then from June through, or from July through the summer, we'll be down at Fort Indiantown Gap. And hopefully, if it keeps rolling like this turnout we've had tonight, we'll be back here in the fall. Anybody else have any questions about organizing this group?
Could
Sue?
you show of hands of the World War II veterans who actually served during that?
Hands of World War II veterans. Harold, that's you. I know. How many kids of World War II veterans? We got you guys beat. Okay, thanks very much. John's going to be here and sign books for you. And you're welcome to look at the memorabilia over here.
Yes.
We were quite a bit south.
You are coming back.
Change.
I think I do.
We got they attacked in front of us.
Oh, they did?
We were embarrassed.
Oh, I know that.
Well, oh, yeah.
When you used to, you had to be no more than 17 years old.
Oh, okay.
You signed on for
I've talked to
friendship
him.
for 20 years, 20 years. It was more like just a radio.
Yeah, first
And then, Sam at that time with us, when you were in
But the way I really got going on this is me. And I was interested. I'm sure it was. Really was. My company commander put
Along with other reasons.
She's going to continue to bring the notices to the